Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Before Canada was a country, before confederation, before provinces, before borders as we know them, there existed an empire within. Not a government, not a nation, but a company. The Hudson's Bay Company. Born from European ambition and sustained by fur, rivers, and trade, it would become one of the most powerful and enduring forces in North American history. Its reach spanned from the icy shores of Hudson Bay to the Rocky Mountains, and from remote trading posts to the bustling streets of modern cities. Through a quick flash of history, canoes gliding across frozen lakes, maps etched with vast, unfamiliar lands, indigenous traders exchanging goods, and the familiar crest of HBC stores, we get a glimpse of its scale and influence. So here's the question. How did a single company grow so powerful it rivaled, and sometimes surpassed, governments themselves? The story of the Hudson's Bay Company begins in 1670, when King Charles II of England granted a royal charter to a group of investors, officially creating the Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay. This wasn't just a business license, it was a bold geopolitical move. The charter gave the company exclusive trading rights over a vast territory known as Rupert's Land, encompassing the entire watershed of Hudson Bay. This region, named after Prince Rupert, the company's first governor, would come to define the company's identity and influence. To understand its magnitude, Rupert's Land covered over 3.9 million square kilometers, larger than France, Germany, and Spain combined. The real spark behind this venture, however, came from two Frenchmen, Pierre-Esprit Radisson and Médard des Groseilliers. After being dismissed by French officials who showed little interest in their fur trading ambitions, the two men turned to England, offering knowledge of rich fur territories accessible via Hudson Bay. Their vision proved irresistible to English investors eager to outmaneuver the French in the fur trade. With their guidance, the Hudson's Bay Company established trading posts along the bay's coastline, tapping into a vast indigenous trade network that had existed for centuries. Hudson Bay itself was the key to the company's strategy. Unlike the long overland routes used by the French through the St. Lawrence River and Great Lakes, the bay offered a direct maritime access point for ships from Europe. This allowed the company to transport goods and furs more efficiently and to maintain a firm grip over its vast domain. Over time, the HBC's influence grew so immense that it began to resemble not just a corporation, but a sovereign entity. It set up forts, raised flags, administered justice, and maintained its own armed forces. What emerged was a company country, a hybrid of commerce and colonial power. For centuries, the Hudson's Bay Company governed lands larger than most European kingdoms, shaping the destiny of the region not through conquest, but through trade, treaties, and quiet authority. At the heart of the Hudson's Bay Company's empire was the fur trade, more specifically, the beaver pelt. In Europe, beaver hats were a fashion staple, and demand was insatiable. To meet it, the company established a network of trading posts across Rupert's Land, strategically located at river mouths and inland crossroads. These posts operated as commercial hubs where European goods, metal tools, textiles, firearms, beads, were exchanged for furs, primarily collected by indigenous trappers and middlemen. Indigenous peoples were not just passive participants in this trade, they were indispensable partners. They knew the land, the seasons, and the habits of the animals. They did the trapping, provided transportation routes, and served as interpreters and negotiators. In many cases, indigenous women also played vital roles, bridging cultural divides and sustaining trade alliances through marriage and diplomacy. These relationships formed the backbone of the company's success for over a century. The fur trade created a vast, interconnected network that spanned thousands of miles. Goods from London found their way into the hands of Cree or Dean hunters, who then brought beaver pelts downriver to HBC posts like York Factory or Moose Factory. These pelts were bundled and shipped back across the Atlantic to satisfy European markets. But this trade was not only economic, it was also cultural. Over time, European and indigenous customs blended. New languages like Michif emerged, diets changed, and clothing, spiritual practices, and technologies were exchanged and adapted. However, this contact brought unintended consequences. European diseases like smallpox and influenza devastated indigenous populations who had no natural immunity. Entire communities were wiped out, disrupting traditional life and weakening long-standing power structures. Additionally, as the fur trade intensified and competition grew, especially with French traders and later with the Northwest Company, alliances shifted and tensions sometimes erupted into violence. The HBC's influence reshaped indigenous economies and societies. While some communities gained wealth and new forms of authority through trade, others were drawn into cycles of dependency or conflict. Over time, as European settlement increased and the fur trade declined, the balance of power would shift dramatically. But in this era, it was the partnership between indigenous nations and the company that built a commercial empire stretching deep into the interior of North America. By the late 18th century, the Hudson's Bay Company faced a formidable challenger, the Northwest Company based in Montreal. Unlike the HBC, which had long relied on indigenous traders bringing furs to posts along the Hudson Bay coast, the Northwest Company took a more aggressive approach. Its traders, often called voyageurs, pushed deep into the interior, establishing extensive overland trade routes, directly competing with the HBC on indigenous territory. What followed was one of the most intense corporate rivalries in history, a battle not just of business strategies, but of influence, geography, and survival. The competition quickly escalated into what some historians call the fur trade wars. Both companies built rival forts near each other, sometimes just a few miles apart, vying for alliances with the same indigenous nations. They offered better prices, gifts, and incentives to attract trappers. Skirmishes broke out, supply lines were attacked, and sabotage became common. One of the most notorious incidents was the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, where a violent confrontation between Métis allied with the Northwest Company and settlers tied to the HBC left over 20 people dead. This wasn't just a business rivalry. It was a frontier conflict with real casualties. The British government, increasingly concerned about the instability and lawlessness in its North American territories, stepped in. In 1821, it forced a merger of the two companies, creating a new, more powerful Hudson's Bay Company that held a virtual monopoly over the fur trade across most of what is now Canada. The merger was less a peaceful union than a hostile takeover, with many Nor'westers being pushed out or absorbed into HBC's expanding system. With its rival eliminated, the HBC extended its reach farther west and south. It established a chain of trading forts like Fort Edmonton, Fort Vancouver, and Fort Garry that would later become the seeds of major Canadian cities. These posts served as economic, administrative, and cultural centers in a vast, sparsely populated land. The company's map of operations began to define the contours of Western Canada, shaping routes of migration, trade, and even the future borders of provinces. In this era, the Hudson's Bay Company became more than just a trader of furs. It became a territorial power, imposing its economic and legal systems across a continent. Its outposts marked the advance of colonial influence and foreshadowed the expansion of Canadian Confederation. The legacy of this era lives on, not just in the names of cities and rivers, but in the deeply entangled histories of commerce, conquest, and colonization. By the early 19th century, the Hudson's Bay Company was more than just a trading corporation. It was effectively a government. In Rupert's Land, a region larger than any European nation, HBC exercised near total control. Its royal charter gave it not only commercial privileges, but also the authority to govern. The company ran its own courts, created and enforced laws, and even maintained its own police force. Justice was often dispensed at remote trading posts, where company officials served as both judge and jury. This made HBC a rare historical phenomenon, a private enterprise that functioned like a sovereign power across millions of square kilometers. One of the most significant experiments in HBC-led colonization was the Red River settlement, located near present-day Winnipeg. In the early 1800s, the company supported efforts by Lord Selkirk to settle Scottish farmers in the region, hoping to create a stable, agricultural base for supplying local posts with food. But the move ignited tensions with the Métis, people of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry, who had established their own vibrant, semi-nomadic communities centered around bison hunting and the fur trade. The Métis saw the influx of settlers as a threat to their land, livelihood, and culture. Conflicts soon followed, including the violent Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, where the Métis, led by Cuthbert Grant, clashed with settlers and company officials. This event highlighted a fundamental flaw in HBC's rule. While it could manage commerce, it struggled to govern diverse populations with competing interests and cultural traditions. The company's colonial policies often favored European settlement and economic control, overlooking the rights and aspirations of Indigenous and Métis communities. Still, the Hudson's Bay Company remained a dominant force in shaping early Canadian colonial policy. It influenced where and how settlements grew, determined trade priorities, and helped shape relations between Indigenous nations and the British Crown. In many ways, it laid the groundwork for Canada's eventual westward expansion, not just through maps and trade routes, but through the imposition of legal systems, land claims, and the architecture of colonial control. As Canadian Confederation approached, the question of who should govern Rupert's land became increasingly urgent. Critics argued that a commercial monopoly should not control the destiny of a growing population. The company's rule, once practical in the fur trade era, was now seen as outdated in the face of emerging national ambitions. This would soon lead to one of the most significant transitions in Canadian history, the sale of Rupert's land to the Canadian government, and the end of HBC's reign as a company that ruled a country. By the late 1860s, the world that had once empowered the Hudson's Bay Company was rapidly changing. The fur trade was in decline. European fashion tastes had moved on from beaver felt hats, and settlers were pushing westward, demanding land and infrastructure. In this new era of agriculture, railways, and political unification, a private company ruling vast territories was no longer acceptable. The pressure mounted for a national solution, and so, in 1869, the Hudson's Bay Company agreed to sell Rupert's land to the newly formed Dominion of Canada. The deal transferred over 3.9 million square kilometers of land to the Canadian government for $300,000, around $1.5 million CAD at the time, along with a guarantee that HBC could retain trading posts and large tracts of land near settlements. This sale paved the way for Canada's westward expansion and the creation of new provinces. But it also sparked unrest, most notably the Red-Eye River resistance, where Métis leader Louis Riel rose up to defend his people's rights in the wake of HBC's withdrawal and Ottawa's arrival. The end of HBC's rule did not mean an end to conflict. It simply shifted power into new hands. With its political influence gone, the Hudson's Bay Company transformed itself into a commercial enterprise for a new age. As cities like Winnipeg, Calgary, and Edmonton grew around its former forts, HBC adapted to urban life. It rebranded itself as a department store giant, opening elegant retail spaces in major Canadian cities. These stores became landmarks in their own right, grand buildings, with high ceilings, marble floors, and everything from groceries to high fashion under one roof. The company capitalized on its legacy, branding itself as a symbol of Canadian reliability and heritage. Today, while it no longer governs territory or trades in furs, HBC remains embedded in the Canadian imagination. Its logo still features the Royal Coat of Arms, a nod to its chartered origins. The company's historic trading posts are now museums and national historic sites. Countless Canadian place names, from Hudson Bay itself to Fort Saskatchewan, echo its presence. Legally, HBC's legacy is also significant. Its original charter and land claims help shape the legal framework for property and governance in Western Canada. In essence, the Hudson's Bay Company morphed from a colonial empire into a modern, retail brand, but it never truly disappeared. It lives on in street names, store shelves, and the very map of Canada itself. It is a reminder of how commerce, empire, and nationhood can intertwine in unexpected ways, and how a company that once ruled the land still leaves its mark, centuries later. From its founding in 1670 as a fur trading venture backed by Royal Eye Charter, the Hudson's Bay Company grew into something few could have imagined, a corporate empire that governed territory larger than most European nations. It built a commercial network that spanned rivers, forests, and mountain ranges, forged complex relationships with Indigenous nations, and played a central role in shaping the geographic and political foundations of what would become Canada. The fur trade declined and the country moved toward Confederation. HBC's power shifted from governance to commerce. The sale of Rupert's land in 1869 ended its political reign, but marked the beginning of its transformation into a modern retail giant. Through its iconic department stores, it adapted to Canada's urban future, while still trading on the mystique of its past. But the company's legacy is deeply layered. It brought European goods and influence to the interior, but it also facilitated the displacement of Indigenous communities and the imposition of colonial rule. It laid the groundwork for Canada's westward expansion, yet often at the cost of those who had lived on the land for centuries. So what are we left with? A company that helped build a nation, yes, but also one that served as an instrument of empire. The Hudson Bay Company is both visionary and controversial, a symbol of innovation and a reminder of colonial ambition. What do you think? Was the HBC a visionary enterprise that helped unite a vast and rugged land, or a colonial machine that expanded British control at the expense of Indigenous lives and sovereignty? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Canadian history, give the video a like, subscribe for more untold stories from the past, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next episode, The Forgotten Rebellions That Nearly Changed Canada.